Why do the wines of the Languedoc deserve your attention, and what are some mouth-watering food pairings? What would it be like to uproot your family in a North American city and move to rural, very rural France for 6 months? And how can you make traveling to any destination more meaningful? Well, tonight you're going to get those tips and stories in our discussion. If you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. I want to know where you're logging in from, what's the weather like, what's in your glass. And of course, if you're here with us live on the live stream, please do the same. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach popular online food and wine pairing courses online, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday, or now it's Tuesday, at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like our guest, whom I'll introduce momentarily. Now, I'm live streaming this video for the first time. It is based on a recorded conversation for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, but I'm here with you live in the comments, so get in there. Let me know, what questions do you have? What stories or tips are you enjoying? And I'll be responding to your comments, as they say, in real time. Now, before I introduce our guest, let me say that 3 of you are going to win a copy of his terrific new book, A Season for That, Lost and Found in the Other Southern France. It's a wonderful book, and we're going to dive right into it soon. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and tell me that you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me. Back to our guest. Steve Hoffman is a Minnesota tax preparer and food writer. His writing has won multiple national awards, including the prestigious 2019 James Beard MFK Fisher Distinguished Writing Award. He has been published in Food and Wine magazine, the Washington Post, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and among others. He shares 1 acre on Turtle Lake in Shoreview, Minnesota, with his wife, Mary Jo. They're elderly and entitled, puggle, he says, and roughly 80,000 honeybees. I forgot to ask a question, but I will about that, Steve. It's so great to have you join us. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a huge pleasure. I feel like we've each read each other's books, and it feels like I know, like you probably know more about me than you wanted to, and maybe vice versa.
Yeah, I always get that feeling from people who read books. It's like, okay, I'm really not that open a person. But no, your book is marvelous. I cannot wait to get into it. But before we get there, your career journey has taken you from tax preparation to wine and food writing. Seems as logical as my own path, but what do these 2 wildly different careers have in common that attracted you to both of them?
Not much, honestly. I was originally a language and literature student. That was my first love. Qualified me for 0 jobs that would actually pay any money. So I spent a lot of the middle years of my life being a stay-at-home dad and finding careers that would pay the bills, basically. So the trip we took to France in 2012 was really a rediscovery of an early version of myself. And so the tax preparation and the writing and food writing careers are very separate in some ways. However, the one thing I would say is that they both involve actually being connected to people. And I know a tax office doesn't sound like that maybe is necessarily true, but it's actually a remarkably intimate place. It's a place where I talk or meet with 500 of my clients every single year. I'm involved in their lives. I see their lives unfold. They need to tell me details about their lives that are in some ways as intimate as what they would often tell their doctors. I need to know whether they have a job or not, whether they have kids or not, whether somebody is sick, how generous they are to charity, where their income comes from, etc. And so, to that extent, there might be a little bit of a tenuous connection between my love of being connected to people, and I think writing about them, and also being involved in people's lives in a professional way, do have a little bit of a story to tell each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that connection. And you may have mentioned this on a previous conversation, but did you compare the tax code to grammar?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that is to some extent a connection as well, which is my original attraction to languages came through a love of grammar. That was how I found my entree into English and writing early on. And then taking French is also or taking any foreign language, I think, is a great way to be retaught the grammar of your own native tongue. And in that sense, yes, grammar is requires you to memorize a certain set of rules and then apply them in a living way to the sentences that you're speaking or writing. And tax preparation is memorizing the United States tax code to the best of your ability and applying it to the very specific situations of your client. So yeah, memorizing and applying a sort of abstruse set of rules is actually a connection between my writing and tax careers.
I love that. So your book, A Season for That, is, as I said, a captivating journey through the Languedoc region of France. What inspired you to write about this region versus, as you say, the other southern France? And tell us what the other southern France is for those of us who don't know.
Sure. So we settled in 2012 as a family for an extended fall semester in the Languedoc region, which I refer to as the other southern France because it is, to some extent, the poor cousin of what most people think of as the southern France, and that would be primarily Provence and the Côte d'Azur, the Riviera, which was extensively touristed, and a lot of money got brought into that region by primarily British people who settled it early in the 20th century. That didn't settle it, but made it their playground, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think of Peter Mayle, A Year in Provence.
Yeah, Peter Mayle, Princess Grace, F. Scott Fitzgerald. There's kind of that wealthy playground element of that part of southern France. And so there's money there. And Languedoc it basically is the portion of Mediterranean France to the west of the Rhone. So the Rhone divides the country in two, similar to the way the Mississippi divides our America in two. East of the Rhone is Provence and the Riviera. West of the Rhone is Languedoc and eventually Roussillon. We settled there in part because we're a middle-class American family and we didn't think we could afford to live for 6 months in Provence. Mm-hmm. So that's how we settled in, quote-unquote, the other southern France. But I would also say that in the end we had the kinds of experiences that we were able to have because we weren't in the grips of a tourist haven that is so good at grabbing you when you arrive and directing you into experiences that are tourist related rather than sort of human related.
I love that. So how long did it take to write the book? Is it about 10 years? 10 years, yeah.
10 years, yes.
2012.
10 agonizing years, yes.
Wow. What were the major hurdles? Agonizing. What agonized you most?
Two things primarily. I would say, first of all, the fact that I didn't feel... Well, first of all, there was just the simple fact that publishing a book there are a lot of gatekeepers between you and publishing your book. And so getting through those gatekeepers was one of the challenges. The other challenge was never feeling as if I'd quite done the experience justice. I knew when we left, Mary Jo and I both knew when we left that something powerful had happened while we were there, more than just simply integrating into a village. Something had happened to me personally in my middle-aged development that we recognized but couldn't put words to. So taking those years were necessary for me to actually get to the heart of the story. And then ultimately, it's as simple as I was a fairly good writer of short pieces, 1,000 to 2,000 words. And the skills and craft necessary to keep a reader's interest and tell a deep and rich story over a book's length was something that was beyond my skills early on. And it really just took a lot of that time for me to at first admit that I couldn't do it, and then seek out the help I needed to be able to do it.
Yeah, I found that too. The challenge with my first book. At first, I just wanted to string together 10 long magazine articles.
Exactly.
This is 10 long magazine. You need a through arc or whatever.
Correct.
Yeah, so that is tough.
I struggled with that same thing with making it cohere. And I laugh. I laugh with, and Mary Jo says the same thing. I can cough twice, and 2,000 words will appear in a Microsoft Word document. Like I don't even have to think about it. It's so natural. And so to unlearn that kind of let's wrap everything up with a pretty bow after 2,000 words, rather than no wait, let's leave things such that the reader wants to turn the page and find out what happens next. That was a very difficult mental shift for me.
And what were the through arcs for you, or the major through arc? Was it your transformation as a human being?
I think the original story that then eventually turned into the memoir. The original story was a very Peter Mayle-esque kind of travelogue. We were here. There was a chronology of how long we were there. We had some kind of very interesting experiences. We got deeper than usual into this part of the world. That was the original story. The parallel story that made it a memoir. The operating word I used as I was trying to imagine what this book should be about was acceptance. And so there is what I think of as the external story of our family's acceptance into this village, and then there's the internal story of a middle-aged man's finding some form of self-acceptance at age 45 that he hasn't been willing to afford himself for a lot of his adult life.
I love that. Yeah, and that's what moves people, because, as you know, like with a memoir, I'll probably never go live in France for 6 months, but I can identify with your journey of self-acceptance. That's a journey anybody and a lot of people take.
And the other important difficult part of that was that for that to be a journey, you need to start in a place that where you're not fulfilled, where you haven't accomplished what you want, where you're in a state of ignorance and incompletion. And then you have to, guide the readers, but also expose yourself and be vulnerable and show that you don't know it all at the beginning, or the ending doesn't have any emotional resonance. So that was the other difficult part, was sort of breaking down my own ego to some extent, so that I could show myself as a very flawed person early in the book, in order for the reader to feel a sense of catharsis or whatever at the end of the book, when I kind of do step into myself in some ways.
And that's also what people identify with, our human vulnerabilities and frailties. And
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you did it well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how did your experience change the way you approach food and wine writing in the Languedoc, being there?
Well, it's a before and after, a very stark before and after story. I was not a food and wine writer at all when we arrived.
Okay.
I had kept journals during our travels over the years. I had dabbled in writing at various times. When I was a stay-at-home dad specifically, I tried writing some short fiction and poetry. That was terrible, and I hope it never sees the light of day. What happened in 2012 is that I kept an extensive journal. It ended up being over 100,000 words, describing what was happening to us on a day-to-day basis, and trying to make scenes and stories and vignettes out of the little adventures that we were having daily. And it was 3 of those journal entries that eventually got crafted into 3 food writing pieces for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. The year we came home, those pieces ended up winning a national food writing award. And suddenly I realized, oh wait, this dream since my adolescence of being a writer might actually be within my grasp. And that really began my food writing career. So that journal is the start of my food writing career. There was not such a thing prior to our arrival.
Wow. So you basically started at the top with winning the MFK Fisher, then reverse engineered your way back to...
I didn't quite get to MFK Fisher immediately. That was several years down the road.
Okay.
But yes, it was a different award. But yes, it was a crazy sort of... And again, that sounds like a Cinderella story. He writes in his journal and then suddenly he's an award-winning food writer. But to be honest, that was the result of an awful lot of work in my very young adulthood, in college and after college, studying literature, paying attention to good writing, reading lots of writers that I loved, writing in a careful way almost my entire life. And so when I took it back up and wrote those journal pieces, that was not somebody who, with straw behind his ear, who had never written anything before or never been interested in writing. I was deeply interested in that whole world for a time, and then just couldn't follow through on it because there was no way to, like I said, pay all the bills and try to be a writer early in my life.
Okay. And how did the experience of the Languedoc improve your understanding of sensuality? You talk about this and how to capture that into words.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really came from that journal, which required me, we would have an adventure, or we would go to a butcher shop, or we would go to a market, or we would meet a winemaker, and I would write about it. And then we would do the same thing, or I would make a similar dish that I had made previously that I described earlier in my journal. Now suddenly I have to describe that again in a way that doesn't simply repeat the way I did it previously. And that, so that dailiness of journaling and the requirement that I describe things once and then again and then maybe again required me to see and feel and pay attention to the experience of eating and of experiencing wine. It made me go several layers deeper, and often those third or fourth descriptions were the best because I'd gotten beyond the initial. You tend to leap to cliches first, and then you think beyond those cliches and ask yourself, well, what am I actually feeling? What are the sort of chords of memory that are actually being struck for me personally, rather than just this tastes funky or this tastes like cherries or this was delicious. So I really think it was that writing over and over. It became a kind of practice that really made me a better writer.
That's great. Well, it's like for many artists, like Picasso had his blue period, and they'll go at one topic, or like the bales of hay or whatever in the fields for, was it Van Gogh or somebody? Yep. And
Yep.
he kept doing it with different light at different
Exactly.
times of the day. And you're right. It's
I
like what ballerinas do at the bar, like.
Correct. It's practice.
Plie.
Yeah, Monet's
Yeah.
water lilies, right? It's an
Yes.
obsessive attention to the same thing, and taking small things seriously enough to and with enough respect that you try to describe them as absolutely accurately as possible. And that training really began in that journal.
Yeah, and it's those small little gems that build the beautiful.
And that will make a whole scene come alive. You can describe it well, and it can have forward sort of narrative momentum. But for me as a reader, it's those moments of magic, those where the prose just sparkles and fires something in your brain where you make a connection.
Yes.
Like, oh my God, I've never thought of it that way. That's such an exciting moment for me that I love trying to create that myself.
It is, and MRIs show that different parts of our brain fire up depending on which sense we're evoking, or like even reading about. Like
Absolutely,
so, yeah,
correct. Yep.
Using different parts. Now, speaking of beautiful writing, you've referred unkindly sometimes to your own writing as circus writing, and your love of beautiful phrases, some of which had to go because they didn't move the story forward. How did you learn to kill your darlings? I guess some people attributed that to Hemingway, but I believe it was Arthur Quiller Couch. How did you learn to have that balance of the beautiful phrases and the keeping the story going, or was it just practice and?
No, there were a couple of turning points there. There's a parallel. The story of our time in France is to some extent a story of me slowly having my ego ground down. There's a kind of arc that goes down to a certain amount of crisis or a certain lack of loss of faith in myself or loss of who I thought I was, that then is rebuilt later. And that process, and Mary Jo, my wife, is a sort of lovingly strict taskmaster when it comes to showing me myself when I'm full of myself. And one of her phrases is to get over yourself, Stevie. You have to get over yourself. And so I had to get over myself as a French speaker and lover of France. In order
was
for
there
us,
a moment? Was there a moment when it came to that sort of crisis or whatever, or did she say something that sort of was the turning point?
There was an early turning point in the story and in our experience where I thought things were going great, and we were, I was looking forward to sitting in cafes and speaking beautiful French and charming my neighbors. And she said, "Stevie, this isn't working." And what she meant was, you're turning this into the Steve Hoffman show, and I and the kids are starting to feel like extras. You need to make something happen here. The kids speak French, but they can't make this. They can't do this. They're not adults, and I don't speak French. So if you want to continue this love affair you have with France, something has to happen this time, or I'm not interested in France. I can go to Madrid. I can go to Austria. I can go to Spain. I could be happy anywhere. So that was very much a turning point. And then there were several efforts to sort of cook my way into the village and to, try to charm my way into the village. And those eventually just failed in a very transparent way. And I was faced with that kind of, I call it the 12-step rock bottom moment, where you admit that you have a problem and you have to change the way you think about things in order to pull yourself out of that. So that happened in the story itself in terms of our journey from arriving as strangers and leaving as friends. But it also happened as part of the writing of the book, which was, I was in love with my own ability to say things beautifully, and at some point that was that had become a form of showing off, not a form of connecting with readers or communicating to readers. And so there was one very specific turning point. This is 7 years into the book now. I believe I'm just around the corner, and I just simply can't believe that the American publishing industry hasn't recognized my genius yet. And I had a coach who said, Steve, you're a beautiful writer, but nobody cares. And they don't care because I know. It's just like, that's a bad moment. That's a bad thing to hear 7 years into a project. But it was really the turning point that turned it into a publishable book and a book that I could be proud of. Because she was saying, similar to Mary Jo, you need to get over yourself. You need to get over how in love you are with your own words and your own ability to describe things and your turns of phrase. You need to start giving the reader the respect and the service they deserve of offering yourself in process, of offering yourself incomplete, and of being much more vulnerable and much more open, and being either in telling the truth or being in the process of trying to understand the truth about yourself. And that was really the difference between, again, this being a very light toe dip into Mediterranean France like Peter Mayle, and it being what I think it turned into, which is kind of a rich story about a man and a family.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. I so identify with that. You're using the beautiful phrases as a shield. I did and still do, unless I catch myself, try to use sort of slapstick humor as a defense. And it's a way of not being vulnerable, of not presenting your whole self.
Absolutely.
And just like, again, tying everything up in a lovely, beautifully written bow or whatever.
Right, yeah, it's a kind of defense mechanism. It's a shield,
Yeah.
but that shield then stands in the way of you connecting with other people.
Yeah.
And at some point, if you're going to write a memoir, you can't be that person. You have to be a different person.
Exactly. It's about that human experience.
Right.
Now, what was the most important thing your editor, the really much respected cookbook author Francis Lamb, taught you?
Well, he taught me that you can always cut more.
Oh, cruel Francis.
There's always something else you could cut. And I gave him, I am still embarrassed to admit the length of manuscript I originally turned into him, thinking that there was some way we could make something out. It was twice the length that I had been hired to write.
Oh.
No, not quite. No, not quite. It was 1.5 times.
Okay. So what was that length like versus what was the final book?
My contract asked for 90 to 100,000 words, and I turned in. Actually, no, it was twice. I turned in 180,000 words. I turned in more, 2 times the number of words. Again, in love with my ability to say things, and. At first, he literally said, I can't even look at this. Like, I don't have time to look at this. You need to get it. And so my agent and I said, this has to change. So I went back to the drawing board. I cut 50,000 words, got it down to 130,000. And then I believe the final manuscript was 115,000 words. So we got very close. But, he delivered some very bad news over and over, and did it in such a smart and caring way. He's such a brilliant editor in that way, that he was able to deliver these just hammer blows of, nope, that we got to get rid of that, or nope, I think we can get rid of this, or nope, I know how much you love this, but it can go. It's not serving the story. And I would fight internally, but I'd eventually find that he was right more often than not. There are a few things I fought back on and insisted on, but he was very good at showing me how cuts could continue, and it wasn't going to make this into something I wouldn't recognize.
Yeah, the only way I could cope with that when I was writing is create another document called Future Book. And I thought, I'm going to use all this stuff. They'll come calling wanting a sequel. It's I haven't looked at it in years.
Nope,
anyway.
Nope. And yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. That's a good strategy. And I did some similar things. I actually literally went through and had a hashtag where I would highlight passages, call them darlings.
Yeah.
And then put them off to the side and figured, I'm going to get back to my darling someday. Yeah. And I have not. In fact, the interesting thing is I now read the book, and I feel as if I can still find places where I could have cut a little bit more.
Yeah. It's that distance that you need.
Yeah.
You noted that, I think we've kind of covered this, but I was listening to another conversation you were in, and you said you needed to become not just a better writer to finish the book, but a better human. Mm-hmm. I guess that was more about your self journey of getting over yourself and just...
Yep, that's very much what we talked about just a minute ago, which is this idea of having to be vulnerable, having to accept your flaws, and accept that people are willing to look at your flaws and still think you're an okay human being.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, I also love your concept of travel as you talk about it, that it's become for many people consumption rather than sort of staying put and experiencing the place. You have a great phrase called collecting capitals, like been there, done that. Okay, there's the Leaning Tower of Pisa and whatever. Is it just part of our consumer culture, our instant gratification? What's going on with that?
I think it's partly that. I think it's also that people are being sold the the they're being sold the idea that their lives are boring and that they need relief from their lives. And so we have this duality where we have our lives, which we're taught to believe are not worthy, and then we have these escapes, whether that's retirement for some people, where you've worked all your life and you hated your job, but now, damn it, you're gonna enter your retirement and be happy. Or there are these vacations, or travel is another form of that, where okay, your life sucks, but you're going to go have a great time for a week or two. And I feel as if, Mary Jo and I have had a phrase for a long time where we talk about trying to lead a life that you don't need to vacate. That your life itself, if you are careful about it and a little bit intentional about it, can be the thing that you want to dive into every day. So yes, I do think there's a consumer element to it. I think there is an element of people, believing somehow that they need to escape their lives and that there's some better life over here if I just show up there. And then, I just think there's a certain fear of boredom. Like Americans really want to go have fun. They want to be entertained. They like manufactured entertainment, or Las Vegas is like that, or Disney is like that, or even many resorts are like that. You're going to play pickleball, and then you're going to go have your Mai Tai, and then you're going to go by the pool, and your day is sort of almost planned for you from the start. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be, most people think they're going to go have the travel experiences that we had, but they set themselves up in such a way that they will never have that experience because they're too afraid that they're not in the right place, that they're going to get bored, that staying in one place is not going to be fulfilling or rich. And I had the opposite experience, which is I would much rather talk to our next door neighbor in in the village that we lived in, who's lived in the same house her entire life, but who can talk endlessly and beautifully about what it means to live in that place, to grow vines in that place, to make wine, to participate in that that Southern French Mediterranean culture. I would spend all day talking to him rather than listen to somebody else tell me about the things they did in Moscow or Paris that a million other people have done to exactly the same degree of depth.
That's true. That's true. Yep. And that also can be what a bad memoir is. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did that.
Correct. Correct.
No one
correct.
cares.
Right. Right.
Yeah, because you also said it was a journey about coming back to yourself. Some really, really interesting observations. You also mentioned Richard Onley, the late great American cookbook writer who you admired, and he lived in Provence, the
Mm-hmm.
main southern France, for 30 years. And he said, go somewhere else and be somewhere else to recommit to where you're from after you travel. I think that happened for you, but maybe you can elaborate. Did you recommit to Minnesota or to who you were, but in a new way? Or
It's a great quote, and I do love, love, love Richard Onley. We can maybe talk about that at more length at some point. He's an idol of mine. I've actually visited the home where he lived in Provence. Huh. It's still there. It's being kept up by a groundskeeper, or a sort of a maintenance guy who lives there and takes care of it. I'm now friends with his brother, who still lives in Minnesota, actually. But anyway, yes, that definitely happened in my case. I would say I didn't go with that intention. I went with the intention of trying to escape myself. I thought I was an uninteresting, upper Midwesterner who was going to escape himself and step into his fully formed identity as a French villager. I didn't have the wisdom of that quote, which is you go, but then you come back to yourself. Against my will, to some extent, that did happen. And I would say what I recommitted to, or had recommitted to by the end of that book, was the core of the most important people in my life, which were the people who were surrounding me while I was there. It was Mary Jo, my wife, and my two kids. And I thought we were going to all discover what how wonderful it was to be someone other than ourselves. And by the end of the book, I'm cooking for and valuing and then essentially agreeing to leave France for these people, because the a season for that really refers to the ending of the book, where I'm accepting that there are not just seasons to the year, but seasons in a person's life. And this is my season to be a father and to be a husband. This is not my season to be a French villager. Maybe that will happen someday, and if so, there will be a season for that. But that acceptance, that coming back to yourself that you're talking about in that only quote, did very much happen in that way. The part of what the village taught me and my experience there taught me was that nothing matters if the core doesn't matter. That all of the beautiful experiences on the perimeter of your life don't matter if the core isn't strong, and there is a recommitment to those core relationships by the end of the book.
Absolutely. I don't know if it was Tennyson, but somebody said to begin where we started and know that place for the first time,
yes,
or something.
Absolutely,
yeah.
yes.
Sort of
correct.
that circular
Correct.
thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you took your two children with you, as you mentioned, who at the time were 9 and 14. How did they react to being uprooted and going to rural France for 6 months?
Well, one was a preteen, or one was an early teenager, and the other was 9 years old. So they reacted very differently in the sense that she was a teenager, with all that. Yes, correct. With all that, with all the self-certainty of a teenager, believing for sure that she was being put upon by being forced not to have lunch at her school lunch table, but actually be in southern France. And then Joe was a pliable, sensitive, nature-loving young man, young boy, and I think he was kind of ready to do whatever he could to be with us, basically. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about that question, though, I think, is I also think that they both. I think, again, there's a lot of. We often think of travel as a way of being somebody else, of being somebody new, reinventing ourselves. And what I observed in the two kids was that what they actually did was adapt the circumstances to who they already were. Mm-hmm. Joe was already a little budding scientist and naturalist and nature lover, and he plunged into the nature of this place. And Eva was already a strong-willed, self-assured young person who imposed that will on her surroundings. Mm-hmm. And I think it was fun to watch them actually be themselves in a new location rather than change to try to be what the location wanted them to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in some ways there was almost more wisdom to that in for them than mine, which was I did really believe I was going to leave and become a new person. I believed I was going to re-inhabit this young man who lived in Paris in my 20s and who was, speaking French and operating competently in a world capital. That's who I wanted to be. And that was somebody other than who I was at the time. So I just thought it was interesting. Mm-hmm. This idea of travel being an escape versus travel being a place where you are yourself with new experiences in a new location, and that you get to be yourself in sort of wondering in an investigatory way in a new place.
Yeah. Absolutely. Living, as you say, with an openness, a vulnerability, and a curiosity. Living, as they say, maybe it's cliche, but living the questions, not the answers.
Yeah, no, I think curiosity is one of the keys to this whole experience. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. And as you said, you were trying to live a life, or not just living a life, but trying to model it for your children. Like, that must have been pretty profound for them to see the transformation, even if they weren't as acutely aware of it as you and your wife were.
Yeah.
They would have known something was happening. And
I think they recognized that something happened. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And can you share any insights about French parenting or family life that struck you as very different from American parenting?
Well, there was a book about French parenting that came out a number of years ago that talked about in France they refer to it as le cadre, which is a frame. I don't know if you've seen that. No. So I'd read about this idea, but then I did very much see it in action, which is the French parenting style And of course, this is a gross, simplification of a diverse country, a huge diverse country. But the French attitude about parenting is that you're inside the frame. There's all kinds of behavior that's normal for kids, and that can even be a little bit disruptive. And anything inside that frame is allowed, but you cannot step outside the frame. So there are certain things that are absolutely forbidden. And we did very much watch that. Kids were really allowed to be kids there, but then you would see that they understood that in certain settings, certain things were not allowed. And so we would often watch. We'd go out for a lunch on a weekend, and there would be an entire French family at a table nearby with kids from very young, 2, 3 years old, up to teenagers, who were quiet, well-behaved, talking, participating, not unhappy, not sulking, eating a fairly broad range of what was served to them. And it didn't look like they were little automatons who were being, their whip was being cracked over their heads. It was that this is what life was. You get to be a kid. You can be a kid to whatever extent you want to be within the frame of this setting, but you can't go running around and screaming, and you can't refuse what's put in front of you. And if your grandmother asks you a question, you answer her. It was beautiful in many ways. The other thing I would say that I really loved and witnessed a couple of times is the tradition of the Sunday lunch, where multiple generations of a family would gather most Sundays around a table, and that was sort of the hallowed and sacred family time, and it was just something really beautiful about that gathering and about reconnecting, that often with the people in your life.
Did you take some of those traditions or rituals back with you? Maybe adapted them, but back home?
I think we had tried to adapt some of that frame idea into our own parenting. And we definitely, if we haven't really done Sunday lunch because it just doesn't lend itself well to American life, but certainly the idea of some regular gathering around the table and eating something that we have cooked together, and where the conversation is the point rather than the meal being the point, and then you all go off to your separate corners of the house. Right. That really did linger, and I think is still a part of our family in a good way.
I'm getting some great ideas here, too. Canadians can be very rushed as well. It's like fueling versus,
Yeah, I mean, Mary Jo and I talk about Thanksgiving in the U.S., which is supposedly the feast where we all gather and sit around a table. It's one of the very few occasions where Americans sort of commit to doing that. And yet, if you watch most American Thanksgivings, it's everybody's talking and watching the football game, and then they all go to the table and they all eat really fast, and then there's no courses. It's all on one plate, all piled up on top of each other. You eat your turkey and potatoes and vegetables, and then you all go back and watch the football game again. It's like, so yeah, there was something about the French willingness to let conversation be the point, and to let conversation be patient with conversation as a way of passing time, that was really refreshing, that we really loved, and that we've definitely tried to sort of incorporate into our own family.
That's great. So why did you choose the village of Otignac, I think it's called?
Yep, Otignac.
Otignac.
Yep.
Why that one? Like, there's lots of little French villages in Languedoc, so...
Yeah, it was somewhat random. There was a certain sort of intentional randomness about it. Mary Jo and I have always liked to challenge ourselves by kind of going underprepared to places and then figuring out what the place wanted to tell us. So there was a bit of that. We knew we wanted to be somewhere south because we're from the north. We're from Minnesota, and so we wanted there to be relatively warm. So it was going to be Mediterranean France. Languedoc was more affordable, was the only thing we could probably really afford. And then it was a question of sending a bunch of emails and hoping to get a response pre-Vrbo, pre-Airbnb. So, yeah, the other thing I would say, though, is that we had had an earlier experience in Brittany in the early 2000s. And as part of planning that trip, there had been several villages or cities, small cities, in the guidebooks that looked really interesting. And there were some kind of impressionist artists who lived in some of the cities along the Brittany coast. And in the end, we had not gone to those places. We'd gone to a place that was about 1,200 people. And what we discovered while we were there was that was about the right size for us. Like, too many fewer people was just going to be like, it was going to be like living with an extended family. There probably weren't going to be merchants and butchers and grocers, etc. But too much more than that, you start suddenly getting maybe into the territory where this is a city that shows up in guidebooks, And then you have an entirely different makeup of the sorts of people who would visit there. So we did also try to limit our search to villages between about 800 and about 1,500 people, and we figured about 1,000 was the golden mean. That was kind of our target, and it turned out to be about right. 800 people, which was the population of Otignac, was a little bit small. It wasn't quite enough to sustain all of the commerce that ideally you would want to be reliably permanent in a village, but it was really close, and it was still about the right size for us.
Cool. Now let's see. The scene at the Café de Commerce sets the tone for the cultural differences. Maybe you can tell us about that and how these initial experiences shaped your approach to immersing yourself in that local culture.
Yeah, I feel like that first scene is sort of the first tolling of the bell that I don't recognize for what it is, which is, this is not going to be what you thought it was going to be, Steve. You imagined something a little bit romantic. You imagined something that would fit itself into your existing skills as a French speaker and a human being. And this whole book is the process of unlearning those things and then relearning of really the way I think of it, I guess, is that I arrive with a preconception of what this should be. There's a lot of breaking down of that preconception in the first part of the book until I sort of stop talking and start listening, if that makes sense. I stop imposing and begin accepting. And the turning point really in that process, in that movement, is more toward the middle of the book when I asked to be part of a grape picking crew and start working in the vines and working in a village winery. That is the moment where I feel as if I stopped trying to tell the place what I thought it should be and started listening to what the place wanted to tell me about what it was. And then at that point, it wouldn't shut up. It kept, at that point, there was sort of an eloquence about everything around us that wanted us to know more. Our friends, our fellow grape pickers, the winemakers that we made, the merchants and vendors, and the fishmonger and the shellfishmonger. Once we started asking questions and being ignorant and full of wonder and expressing, not just with our words but with our whole attitude, how interested we were in this place, everybody started wanting to tell us more about this place. And so, in the end, it's this sort of irony that you feel like you'll learn the most by showing people how much you know, so they'll respect you and want to share their information. And in fact, it was just the opposite. It was when we were our most openly vulnerable and wondering and full of wonder that we gained the most knowledge, true knowledge about what this place was about.
Yeah. And you also, while we're in the cafe kind of frame of mind here, you mentioned the importance of aperitifs in French culture. What was your favorite aperitif discovery?
Well, there's a French vermouth called Noilly Prat, Noilly Prat, Prat, that is actually made in the Languedoc. It's made in a city called Marseillan, which is near the sea. And so we actually took a tour of where they actually make that. It's called a vermouthery. And one of my very favorite aperitif by the time we left was just simply a little bit of vermouth with a little spritz of lemon and a twist of lemon peel. And it was, most Americans don't drink vermouth. They drink vermouth as a mixer, not as its own beverage. And so discovering that as a sort of beautifully dry, refreshing, very aromatic opener to a meal was this wonderful discovery.
And you say aromatic. What did it smell of?
Well, they use, it's one of those old formulas, kind of like the monks. They use this dozens and dozens of different herbs and spices when they mix it, and they have a single person who's associated with their organization that is the ultimate tester, who says yes, this is, or no, this is not yet what this should smell like. So there's a lot of maceration, a lot of blending of different wines, and so it I don't know that I could describe the exact aroma, but it's a sort of marine, saline, herbal aroma, and then that gets cut with the sharpness of the lemon, and it's just a beautifully refreshing drink. The other really fun aperitif experience we had is just how much people make their own in this village. So a lot of people will they'll have their little cave in the basement that's full. The shelves are full of homemade vin d'orange, orange wine, homemade suze, which is sort of a citrusy, bitter aperitif. They make walnut wine, which is made from green walnuts and red wine. And so a lot of times you'll go to somebody's house for a meal, and they will actually go down and then bring up these aperitifs, which is really fun. And we have started doing that at home as well. We started making our own aperitifs at home as well.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great. And can you share like a story or a moment where you had a cultural misunderstanding and that led to enlightenment, or even just some humor along the way?
I'll tell you, the first one that comes to mind did not happen while we were in France at this time, but it is a funny. It was a funny moment. When I was younger, I'd been in Paris. I worked for the Little Brothers of the Poor, which is an outfit that serves elderly people and tries to relieve their loneliness by offering them company and conversation. And so I worked for that organization in Paris, and the members of the organization came to Minneapolis to visit, because there was also a fraternity in Minneapolis. And I was up introducing, this is Steve, very proud of his French. I'd been in Paris. I could speak well. I had a good accent. I was all proud of myself. And I got up to introduce the president of the Little Brothers of the Poor, the Petits Frères des Pauvres. And I had just heard a phrase in a book that I'd been listening to in French in my earphones. And I was very proud of it. And it's soulever le cœur, which, if you know a little bit of French, sounds like it means, right, lifting our heart, right? Okay. Lever means to lift, and so soulever le cœur. And so I said, please let me warmly introduce this gentleman who nous soulève le cœur, who lifts up all of our hearts. But actually, soulever le cœur in French is an idiom that means to vomit. So, very formally, very proud of myself, in front of the lectern, I invited everybody to look at this man and to please vomit.
I love it. How did he respond, or did he just say...
Everybody was very polite, and then somebody came up to me and whispered in my ear afterwards, and I've never lived it down. I still have nightmares about that moment.
That's great. And you described the rural rhythm of life, or the rhythm of life in rural France. Of course, that would have been different from the United States, very busy. Was there anything else about the rhythm in France? You talked about really deeply understanding the seasons, because, there's a time to pick grapes, and there's a time to whatever. And
Yep.
if you don't, you miss the next season's work or whatever.
Yeah, I do think, certainly, yes, that was part of it, this sort of... coming to the point where you start thinking about the unfolding year as not months and days, but as seasons, and you look forward to the next season, and you participate fully, and then you let that season be done and don't mourn it, because you know it's going to come around again. That was a really powerful lesson that I think we learned by living there. The other thing that I talk about in the book that I really believe is true is there's something very refreshing about the attitude about life that comes when you live in a place where years are thought of as vintages. And when you're in wine country, years are vintages, and there are good vintages and bad vintages. And I think, there's a Western sort of American idea that time is this upward graph line, right? You're going to have some ups and downs, but it still represents something like progress toward a big goal, or that things are good. If they don't get better every year, they're gradually getting better all the time. And it was a really refreshing sort of disruption of that idea to be in a place where there are good and bad vintages, but it's never always going to get generally better. There are going to be very good years, and then there are going to be mediocre years, and there are going to be bad years. And you deal with them the best you can as a winemaker and as a participant in that process, but you don't ever live with the illusion that things can keep getting better. What you do is sort of, it forces you to be present in the moment, because it's not like, if I just wait long enough, things are going to get better. That's never the case. It's I need to make the best of this year, because this is what this year has given me in terms of climate and circumstances and life events. And I just loved, in the end, I loved thinking about the unfolding of time that way.
Yeah, the circular seasons, the cyclical nature, rather than, as you say, the linear
Absolutely.
upward progression. Absolutely great. So your description of my French is not as good as yours. I didn't continue it much even though we are supposed to study it in Canadian schools, but c'est très mauvais. But your description of, is it sèche farci?
Yes.
It's very vivid. Maybe you could share that description with us, like what you remember of it, and the wine pairing.
Yeah, sure. It's actually quite common to stuff shellfish in southern France, in Mediterranean France. So they do a lot of stuffed mussels, where you actually open up mussels, put like sausage meat in, and then close it back up, and then cook it. And this sèche is French for cuttlefish, and farci means stuffed. And so one of our first in that opening scene in the cafe, where I'm realizing that this is going to be much more challenging than I thought, I didn't actually recognize 3 of the 4 items on the menu, one of which was sèche farci. And so a cuttlefish looks a little bit like a kind of a truncated round squid. And the waiter basically brings a plate from another diner saying, here's what you're asking for. And it looked, like the stomach of a freshwater fish stuffed with sausage. It smelled like aromatics. It smelled like garlic and onion and sausage, but then it had this sort of marine kind of, oceanic kind of, I call it saltwater pier. It smells like what it would smell like if you're near the ocean, which was so it was terribly ugly physically, but very beautiful in the sort of complexity of the aromas that were arising off of it. And it was, again, a first introduction into what we would learn about what it meant to eat here, which is, we're from Minnesota, upper Midwest, a lot of sort of German, Scandinavian, and Eastern European influence on our cuisine. And we think of smelly food as food that has gone bad, that food that's off. And this was an initial introduction into the fact that food here is actually strongly flavored and strongly smelling, and that's considered in many cases an advantage, not a disadvantage. And so, then we would learn to cook with garlic, and we would learn to love anchovies, and we would learn to eat blood sausage, and we would learn to like lamb, more than beef to some extent. And it was very much an education in accepting, and we learned to love strong fish like mackerel. It was very much an experience of accepting that there are strong flavors and strong smells in food that are a positive virtue, instead of our fear of them that I experienced growing up as a kid in the Midwest.
And what would you pair with that sèche farci?
Well, I love, it's a cliche, but what grows together goes together, right? And so I would probably pair it. I mean, it's not a fine dining kind of dish. It's much more peasant food. So there's a wine from that region that probably looks out over the sea where that cuttlefish had been swimming, called Picpoul de Pinet. It's a very acidic, very tart, dry white wine from, a half an hour drive from where I was sitting at the time. And it's more of a casual wine. There aren't like great vintages of Picpoul de Pinet. It's meant to be drunk young and fresh, usually with seafood. So that would be my choice.
Yeah, that sounds great. What are a couple of other memorable dishes you had there, whether you prepared them yourself or had them in a local cafe? Maybe tell us about those, and of course the wine pairings.
Good question. I would say we are in the Fougère appellation, which is sort of a small but well-respected appellation in the Languedoc region. And there is a southern French red wine stew called daube, D-O-U-B-E. And we encountered it early before I really knew what it was. And then by the end of the story, I'm actually making my own daube. And so, and it's kind of fun that it's traditionally actually made in what's called a daubière, which is a earthenware vessel that's completely sealed, and so all of the juices and all of the steam sort of recirculates inside that vessel to cook the meal. And it's red wine with beef, lamb, or any other sort of slow braising meat, and then some vegetables and aromatics. And so cooking my own daube, and then learning the little trick that you can make some dough out of flour and roll it around the outside of your cocotte, of your Dutch oven, and that will actually seal it in a way that recreates the original daubière that some shepherd in the hills invented however many hundreds of years ago. Having that and using the local wine, the Fougère wine, which is a strong sort of earthy, herby, powerful wine in the stew, and then drinking that same wine as our pairing was memorable, and my mouth is watering as I'm talking about it right
it
now.
sounds great.
Yes.
And that was a local red wine?
Yes, correct. That was the wine that was made in our village. Right.
Oh,
right.
okay.
Yeah. So not just local, but literally, I knew the winemaker who had made that wine. He was a friend. Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. And you also talk about the importance of bread in French culture. Maybe was there an experience related to bread or baking bread during your stay?
Yeah, I mean, there's the typical, the baguette is a subsidized thing in France, and so even many villages that can't afford their own, grocery store and butcher will usually have a boulangerie or a baker. So bread and baguette specifically became a part of everyday life. But there's a fun bread that actually, so my daughter, after resisting me for most of this trip and resisting the food that I'm trying to put in front of her and trying to expand her palate, very effectively resists me for most of the story. By the end of the book, she has started to teach herself baking. So she's going to cook, but she's going to do it her own way, and she's not going to use she's not going to cook the way Dad cooks. And she ended up making something called a fougasse, Fougasse. And it's basically a southern French Provençal version of focaccia. And you can see the resemblance in the two words. And a fougasse is usually, it has that kind of light airiness of a focaccia, but they will usually shape it. They'll roll it out and then make cuts in it that shape it like a big leaf. And so watching Eva make a fougasse, which was both a repudiation of me because she was cooking what she wanted her way, but also like an acceptance of me because she was not cooking American banana bread. She was cooking a real, true Southern French delicacy. Was kind of a beautiful moment, where I was like, okay, yeah, I did actually get through a little bit.
I love that connection.
Yeah.
So back to the wine of the Languedoc, of course. One of the more intriguing cultural notes in your book is how vineyard workers were once paid with daily rations of wine, considered a necessary part of their nutrition. How does that deep-rooted connection between wine and work show up in French culture today, if it still does?
Well, certainly, workers are no longer in the EU. Workers are no longer allowed to be given 2 liters of wine as part of their wages. I would say, though, that working in vines and wineries certainly taught me about how hard that work is physically. And I would also say that if, again, there is an extent to which in wine country, and this is something that I loved, wine is not just a pleasant accompaniment to life. It literally forms everything. And there's a sort of pervasiveness about it that's really beautiful. It's, people will take the entire month of September off from their regular jobs just to work picking grapes and working in wineries of their friends. Like it's a true seasonal moment that we've lost, I think, in a lot of settings where we don't do things like this anymore, where we've lost touch with the land and with agriculture, and then even to some extent, I think the vines themselves actually form the landscape. I mean, you look around and there's some patches of scrubland here and there are hills, but mostly what you're looking out over is vines, and the vines have actually dictated what the landscape looks like. I think of it as equivalent to, this is going to sound funny, but I think it's equivalent almost to New York skyscrapers, right? Oh. In the sense that New York skyscrapers tell you what is valued in this place, right? And in this place, what's valued is business and commerce and finance. And if you look out over the landscape of the southern of the Languedoc, what you see is vines, and that's the landscape having interacted with humans, but also telling you this is what is valued here. This is wine, and then the wine itself, the beverage, just becomes a part of everything. It's work. It's what creates enough revenue that the village can survive. But then it's also something that you have with almost every meal. And often it's going to be wine. It's not going to be fancy wine from Bordeaux or Burgundy. It's going to be the wine that somebody probably made. And it's just this really beautiful integrated experience.
Lovely. And why do you think the Languedoc has still remained in the shadow of Bordeaux and Burgundy, northern regions of France, despite the fact it is the largest vineyard area in the world? Why? I know things are changing, technology improves and so on, but Why do you think it still remains in the shadow?
I mean, I think there's just, excuse me, there's a simple fact of economics. It's been a poor region for a long time, and wine is a capital and money intensive endeavor. Like, you can make better wine if you have more money to throw at the various problems that arise in the fields and in the vineyards over the course of the year. However, in the Languedoc, there's actually a very specific reason, I think, which is that there was a treaty back however many years ago, centuries ago, but very early, where basically France and Britain agreed that any wine being shipped out of the port of Bordeaux had to be Bordeaux. And so other regions that surrounded it could eventually ship their wines, but only after all of the Bordeaux had been sold.
Oh.
And so the Languedoc had nowhere to ship its wine. The Bordeaux winemakers could ship to the very lucrative northern markets of Britain and northern France and Germany, and Languedoc had to wait in line, and often there was no place to send that wine. And so that was a handicap that I think has, and then Bordeaux is sending this very expensive wine and getting paid for it, and then creating chateaus, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling sort of generational wealth issue that the Languedoc just never had a chance to benefit from.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd never heard of that. And for a long time, of course, then Languedoc has been known as the lake of wine. It's so big, but also producing mass market inexpensive wines, even
Right.
serving as rations for the French army.
Right.
So what is changing? Is there anything lots of wine regions around the world that were previously reviewed as average are improving technology, understanding of their climate and their soils, and exchanging information with other winemakers around the world. Is there anything in particular that's changing in the Languedoc that's unique to that area?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, part of the reason for the Lake of Wine thing is that, again, these were peasants who were growing grapes. These are not winemakers, and so when they weren't able to export, quite often what they ended up making, it was actually wine to be distilled into brandy, because they could actually ship brandy out of Bordeaux. They just couldn't ship wine out of Bordeaux.
Okay.
And what that emphasized was growing for volume, for tonnage. And so
Right.
they would use types of vines that generated lots and lots of grapes, but that didn't make high quality wine. What's changing is that it's still actually an affordable place to buy a hectare of vines. And so young winemakers can come in and they can afford to experiment. And what they're experimenting with quite often is organic, natural, or biodynamic winemaking. And the reason that you can get away with that now in the Languedoc is that it's not a northern climate with lots of moisture in the air. It's still a Mediterranean climate. It's very dry. And so, I mean, a lot of the chemicals that you end up putting on grapes when you're using chemicals to avoid spoilage are chemicals that combat mildew and moisture. And the Languedoc naturally doesn't have much of that. And so it's a place that you can plausibly experiment with natural wine, because the land you're sitting on is not so incredibly expensive that you have to make a great wine every year. And then additionally, the climate itself makes it actually quite amenable to natural and biodynamic wine, which is a really dynamic growing sector of the wine world, and is in some sense, in this case, a return to a very, it's like organic gardening, a return to a very old way of making wine that is natural to this place. It's historic in this place.
Okay. And was there a particularly memorable encounter that you had with a winemaker?
Well, I ended up working, as I said, in the vines, and then working in a village winery that housed two winemakers, one renting from the other, who became very good friends of mine and remain friends. There's a moment at the end of the harvest. Excuse me, I'm just going to...
Yeah, please take your time.
There's a moment at the end of the harvest. There's a sort of celebration that happens at the end of the harvest. In the Languedoc, they call it a soulenc. It's called other things in other parts of the country. And so we were invited as part of the picking crew, and we met. We had worked with a gentleman named Thierry Rodriguez, who was making very, very ambitious wine. And we had felt that we were learning so much that we owed these people a lot. Like, we owed them this whole experience, because they had for some reason been willing to take us in and teach us and welcome us into their world. And there's a moment near the end of that event where we're eating actually stuffed mussels, And I take a sip of Thierry's highest end wine, which is a beautiful wine that resembles a sort of Southern Rhone wine. It's the first time I've had it. It's sort of his pride and joy. And I take a sip of that wine, and as I'm doing so, I look across the room at him, and I see that he's watching me drink his wine and seeing how much I'm loving it. And Mary Jo and I kind of sort of have a silent conversation about it. And I see that he's actually moved. He's actually like moved to tears at watching me love what he's made.
Wow.
And it was a turning point in my whole relationship with him and again with our neighbors, where I suddenly had the idea, oh, wait a minute, we're actually giving something back here. Our love of this place, our curiosity, our interest in this place, our embrace of wine as a sort of way of life, is that like this is a two-way street. We haven't just only taken, we have given back. And it was very clearly that there a turning point at that very moment as I'm holding up that glass of wine and watching him be moved by the fact that what he has made has had an effect on me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Now, one of the more another poetic moment in the book is your description of a winemaker blending 27 wines in a lab, adjusting for color, structure, mouthfeel, like an artist mixing paints. What surprised you most about this blending process?
Well, I would say just the sheer stamina of what it takes to taste wine, which you talk about in your book as well. You know, you taste 20 or 50 or 100 wines in an afternoon. And it's physically grueling because you're standing most of the time, but it takes a huge toll on your mouth. Like your mouth is sort of ruined for the rest of the day, if not several days. But primarily it's intellectually grueling. It feels like trying to solve a physics or a calculus problem. You have these 27 bottles, and each one is a different grape, and each one is from a different parcel. And some of them may have been aged in oak, and some in stainless steel, and some used traditional fermentation, and some used carbonic maceration. And the times that they've been macerating is longer or shorter. I mean, it's this incredible puzzle that you're putting together, and the winemaker and the enologist are doing this in their head and somehow managing to remember the elements of all these different wines that would go together to make a great vintage that is not only great in itself, but that also then resembles the vintages from prior years and will resemble the vintages in the future, so that customers can rely on, if they buy this wine is going to be what they fell in love with during the last year that they bought it. So I just felt like the intellectual and just sort of the brain power and concentration involved in tasting wine was beyond anything I could have ever imagined.
Great. And the winemakers you met also seem to have very strong opinions on rosé. Of course, Provence is famous for rosé. One of them said it should look happy to see you. The wine should look happy to see. I love that. And criticizing the pale, bony rosés of Provence. What did they mean by pale, bony rosés? That sounds personal.
It does. I think what he meant is that there's a certain style of Provençal rosé, which is kind of a very pale, kind of onion skin color. And the idea behind it is that it's a sipping wine. It's a delicate, it's a sort of, it's not full flavored. And again, going back to our having fallen in love in some sense with flavorful food and almost smelly food, there's an extent to which in this part of the world, wine is respected for its ability to contend with flavorful food. And I think if I had to interpret what he was saying, it was that that kind of wine, that sort of very pale, not very aromatic, not very flavorful, not full in your mouth kind of rosé, is sort of a betrayal of what wine should be in this part of the world, because what we want is wine that will be paired and that will kind of war amicably with the flavorful food that we also serve in this part of the world. And so, a rosé should have a blush. It should have rosy cheeks, and it should be full-fleshed, and it should be ready to contend with good, flavorful food.
I love the way you put that. That's great. Okay, wow, time's flying. All right, let's see now. Oh, I have to ask you about this, because there's a striking passage in your book where you describe how you stopped thinking of wine in terms of Old World and New World regions and started categorizing it according to latitude. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's, I think, maybe one of the biggest insights I got from living here, which was understanding the nature of the wine that was made there, which was that it's a sort of, the sun bakes a lot of sugar into the grapes. There's high alcohol, there's a lot of sugar that turns into a high alcohol wine that leads to something called sort of roundness or voluptuousness. And I realized at some point that, this happens because there's there's so much sun that's falling onto this parcel of land. This is where grapes were meant to grow, is the Mediterranean. And to some extent, the winemakers from more northern regions, Bordeaux to some extent, but certainly Champagne, the Loire, and Burgundy are all dealing with the problem of underripe grapes. And it just sort of rewired my brain in terms of how do I approach a glass of wine if I've never had it before. I used to try to ask myself, well, is this New World or Old World, or does this come from Chile or Italy or France? And now I ask myself, basically, as my first sort of sorting mechanism, does this feel round and alcoholic, or does this feel sort of tense and acidic? And I decide how much I love wine based on those gradations, and came to a point where at some point these Languedoc wines were kind of like my home team, and I love them because of my emotional connection to them, but I also love them because I fell in love with wine by drinking them.
Yeah, and stylistically they are more New World, or what we traditionally think of as New World, like the big Australian wines or whatever. Like they have their own signature, but still they're far more in common with them than, say, a Bordeaux.
And part of what that comes from is that this is actually a place where grapes get ripe. And so, a lot of the New World over-ripening to make big wines that, Robert Parker would like, are really an imitation of what Mediterranean wines do all by themselves, but they're grapes that are meant to grow in that kind of heat, and so they retain a certain structure and elegance despite the fact that they are very, very ripe.
Yeah, cool. And then a couple of winemakers spoke about roasted stone aromas and a kind of agreeable bitterness from schist soil. Maybe just touch on those two, because I found those fascinating.
I think, the soil underneath the Fougères appellation, which is where we're living, is schist soil, and it becomes a marketing term to some extent. Every appellation is trying to sell you on the virtues of where it's grown and how those wines are made. So that was an attempt by somebody, one of the winemakers I was tasting with, to describe what the effects are of schist soil in the final wine. What I would say, and if we want to get real for a minute, I think you probably agree with me, is that there's quite a lot of bullshitting when you're talking about wine.
Yep.
There's a certain amount of pretending, right? Yep. Like pretending you know what you're talking about and saying something that's very subjective as if it were the truth. And at some point, the more you talk about wine, there comes a point where you just feel comfortable giving it your best and trying to say something that makes some sense, and it may or may not be accurate. And yes, there are experts who are very good at being very specific and sort of almost scientific about the flavors in wine. But there's also an element of talking about wine that's just kind of fun, and you're kind of bullshitting with your buddies, and you try something. And so does it taste like roasted stone? I don't really know, honestly. Would I probably say that because it sounds smart? I probably would.
Oh, you come a long way, Steve. Look at you. We're so proud of you.
Exactly. See, I'm getting over myself.
Oh, my goodness. This is wonderful. As I say, the time's flying, so let us wrap up with a few things. What would be a tip or two if someone's visiting the Languedoc? I guess maybe on the one hand, if they only do have a few weeks, versus someone who is going to plant themselves there for 6 months, which is probably not the case for most people.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that in the upper Midwest, because we're sort of cattle country, we think of as like the most reliable food you can eat is beef or hamburgers, because it's always there, it's always relatively fresh, everybody uses it. And what you'll find in the South is that seafood and fish is the equivalent of that. Huh. So I would just go. I would not be afraid to go to popular places that aren't necessarily Michelin starred, but somewhere near or on water, eating the shellfish or the fish that has been caught within sight of where you are. The wines are going to be local. They're going to automatically go with what you're eating. It's going to be simple preparations. And actually the hamburgers are quite suspect, but the shellfish is going to be beautifully fresh. And that experience of just sort of sitting in a village, looking out over water with good seafood in front of you and a glass of rosé or a glass of good white wine is, I think, what that place is about.
Love that. All right. Well, let's. There's so many more. I didn't get to So, but where can we find you and your books online?
Yeah, I'm pretty findable online.
Okay.
But I am probably social media wise, I'm most active on Instagram.
Okay.
And if you think of just SJR Hoffman, as in Stephen John Raymond Hoffman, that's where you can find me in most contexts. So
Okay.
my website is www.sjrhoffman. My email is steve@sjrhoffman.com. My Instagram handle is @sjrhoffman. And other than that, in North America, my book is available in most major bookstores. It can be found on Amazon. The one other thing I would say is that I was also the narrator of the audiobook.
Yes,
And there's
you did a great
there's-
job. That's what I listened to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I'm very proud of it. You know, most people think that they're going to hate their voice recording, you know, their own voice on tape. And in the end, I was very proud of how that book turned out. And there is also quite a lot of French and quite a lot of sort of French-inflected English and conversation in the book that I feel got conveyed by my narrating it, that is maybe harder to be conveyed when you're reading the book if you don't have a French background. Yeah. So that's the only other thing I would say, is that I think the audiobook turned out beautifully.
Absolutely, and especially for a memoir. I think the author must read it unless they really don't want to, or there's some other reason. But no, you really infused it with that sense of being there. And yes,
thank you.
You're beautiful.
Thank
French.
I'll take it.
Yeah, still cling on to that. Is there anything that you wanted to mention that we haven't said or covered before we wrap up?
Well, this answer might take more time than you want.
I'll try to say it.
I'll try to say it
quickly. We're not in a
quickly.
rush here. I'm just trying to, I know I've drilled you now for more than an hour and a half.
There was one, I've written about this outside the book, but there was one thing I feel like we learned here. There's a French concept called a bon moment, B-O-N moment. So it means, it's translated directly as a good moment. But in France, it has all kinds of other connotations. A bon moment is one of those moments, and I think everybody who's listening will recognize one of those moments. I'm sure you will, where you're sitting with people that you care about, where there's good wine and there's good food, and that is the centerpiece. That's the excuse to be together. But then the moment unfolds into something greater than itself. The conversation becomes meaningful, and you start finding interest in the people around you, and you're laughing, and time sort of disappears, and you can be there for hours and not notice it. And you know, I think in America we undersell just the sheer pleasure of a moment like that. And that was one of the things that I learned that I really feel like I've taken with me, and I think everybody can think about as something to take seriously. That there are these moments in life, and often the best of them happen with good food that you've prepared, or that somebody you love has prepared, and wine or some other good beverage, and taking that seriously as something that makes life worth all of the hassle is something I took away from that extended experience in France, and that I've tried to keep in mind ever since. I really think a bon moment is a time when life is at its best.
Oh, lovely. I'm going to look for a bon moment this weekend.
There you go.
Cultivate that little...
And sometimes you can't make it happen, and it's also recognizing when it does,
yes.
right? When you didn't expect it,
yes.
And then, oh no, wait a minute, this is blossoming. Like, this moment is blossoming, and instead of trying to hurry through it or imagine when you get back to your phone, to sort of sink into that moment, because really this is what life is about.
Oh, my goodness. That's where we will end. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been so enjoyable. I could have gone for another 2 or 3 hours, but I think you would have lost your voice.
No, I could have too. But thank you. Your questions are so thoughtful.
Oh,
you really put so much care and thought into asking these questions. They really went a lot deeper than some other interviews I've had, and
Yay,
I just appreciate it very much. Yeah, no, you really did your research, and it's clear that you care, and that's part of what this is about too. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right. Well, all the best, Steve, and I look forward to the next time when we can have this glass or two in person.
I'm looking forward to it too, and I'm looking forward to your next book as well.
Thank you, and yours. So get busy. No,
I'll get to it.
Okay. Cheers.
All right. Take care.
Bye.